ASPM is recognizing the sprawl with too many bad scanners and the opportunity there. But the actual opportunity is not like, let's consolidate all of this into one dashboard. The actual opportunity is like, let's fix and figure out how much we can do without an agent to scan all of this code and put the story together and give developers something that they can fix. And so there is an opportunity with ASPM, but it's not through the dashboarding approach.
Welcome to the Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host, joined by my amazing co-host Tristan, a former security engineer and co-founder of Escape. Today, we're joined by an amazing guest, James Berthoty. James has been in technology for over 10 years across engineering and security. An early advocate for DevSecOps, he has a passion for driving security teams as contributors to products. With all his experience, he's currently building latio.tech, a platform helping organizations find the best security tools on the market. In our latest episode with Tristan, we challenged James about his recent article on ASPM. We discussed what's right and wrong with its current state and what ASPM might look like in the future. Dive right in.
Excellent. So James, 1 year ago, I remember myself reading an article wrote by Mark Turfey, a security founder, and this article was called "Security People Want Less Tools, Not More Tools." It's called like a security tool crash is coming, and you're the maintainer of a repository of application security tools, latio.tech. What do you think of this statement? Security people want less tools, not more tools. Do you agree with that? Do you think there are too many security tools out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of I was glad to see this article and work my way through it, where I'd say like I half agree. I fundamentally don't think security teams are overwhelmed with the number of tools, but they just are overwhelmed with the amount of alerts that are happening. And so the core problem remains like, how can we fix things and like actually make progress? And I think that comes across. Many teams walk away thinking like, I have all these alerts because I have all these tools. But in reality, if you had 20 tools, but they only generated true positive alerts, you would probably stick with having 20 tools. Because if they were all providing value, you wouldn't get rid of them. And so I definitely understand the sentiment. And just going through the rest of his article as well, I think a lot of what he wrote applies to the large CSPM marketplace, because all of those vendors were heavily VC funded, heavily betting on like, we are going to overtake Palo, CrowdStrike, like we are going to be big, giant public companies. And when you have that sort of race to the top, it sort of does exactly what he's talking about, where like, there's no reason to have Wiz, Lacework, Sysdig, Aqua all in the same environment. There's just no benefit to that. But what I've actually seen, I just because I think that some of those companies will fail, but the smaller companies, especially within AppSec, that are operating really well, I don't think there's a reason that those have to go away. Because one of the main things I've learned, because my background is not in giant enterprises, but giant enterprises are the main consumers of application security tools.
Right.
And if you're a well-funded, lean startup that's providing real value, you only need like 5 to 15 of those contracts to stay afloat. And if your goal isn't to, take over the world, to put the end to Palo, whatever, like, then you can really sustain yourself for a long period of time here. And so that's where I just think that, like me, before I got into the Latio space, I was very unaware of the amount of tooling that existed out there and the amount of things that I could do. And I would have thought the same way, that it was like, do I choose between Wiz, Sysdig, or Lacework, or like the main ones that I was aware of in Aqua? But just knowing that there's like so many more options that are doing much more specific things and providing value. I really don't see it that way. I think the main thing that's left that I think is true is CISOs. It's getting harder because of budget constraints to argue for why these niche tools are needed, because the attention span is shorter on that stuff. And so really that's the main battle, is like sort of everyone versus the enemy of like, well, I'll just increase our Palo CrowdStrike budget, and then we'll get all the functionality we need. We don't need these new tools. So I think that's the main struggle, but I don't think it's primarily a too many tools problem. I think it's a too many bad tools problem.
Okay.
Great. That's a strong statement.
Yeah. What do you define as a bad tool, actually?
Yeah, I mean, I usually just tell the story of like when I was the first AppSec tool I used, which I won't name. Uh, like I thought there was something, like I thought I was just stupid or something, because I was getting like just thousands and thousands of alerts into like a terrible dashboard across like 100 microservices. And I was like, how do we ever make progress on this? And I was having like quarterly meetings with my developers trying to talk through like, is this a true positive? Is this a true positive? I was a lot worse at coding. I'm still not great at it, but I'm better than I was then. And like I was going through piece by piece, like what is wrong with me? And then I finally uh, tried Sneak when Sneak was this is like when Sneak very much was like taking over the AppSec market in that consolidation phase, and I was like, whoa, I'm not stupid. Like this tool I was using just sucks. Like because Sneak's telling me like, oh, I need to go from this version to this version, and this is probably a
Mm.
false positive, and here's better information about the vulnerability. And I can just use webhooks to scan and pipeline. I don't need to stand up my own Docker images and all this stuff. Um, and so really within that story, it's a bad tool is one that's just flooding you with pointless information. Um, and that's not fundamentally helpful for developers. Because every time I walk into a developer meeting with a bad tool, it makes me look foolish and it makes the developer waste a bunch of time. And so whatever can help fix that problem, I think, is the best tool that helps security look smart and fundamentally does that by telling the developers what they need to know to fix the issues.
And do you think that ASPM is the strategy to tackle kind of that alert fatigue problem that you mentioned?
I this is why fundamentally I think ASPM's like at a big crossroads, and I disagree so much with how a lot of the market has taken it, where it's garbage in, garbage out. Like if you view ASPM as this like single pane of glass for all of your application vulnerabilities, if those tools are giving bad information and all you're doing is like creating like, look, you have 3 more widgets to filter by, you can see which pipelines have this tool versus this tool, like that's pretty meaningless information that doesn't get to the heart of the problem. And so I think the real opportunity with ASPM is if you look at it, I just try to parallel it directly to CSPM, where the reason that Wiz took over CSPM so heavily is because they didn't just aggregate a bunch of findings. They instead tried to push to the limits of like, what can we do without an agent to get visibility and to surface those findings in a way that makes a lot of sense to security teams. And in the same way, ASPM is recognizing the sprawl with too many bad scanners and the opportunity there. But the actual opportunity is not like, let's consolidate all of this into one dashboard. The actual opportunity is like, let's fix and figure out how much we can do without an agent to scan all of this code and put the story together and give developers something that they can fix. And so there is an opportunity with ASPM, but it's not through the dashboarding approach.
Okay, and I think, most of our listeners are application security engineers, but maybe some are just, in the beginning of this journey. We always kind of try to provide the definition at the beginning. So if you could just a little bit, give, because we already like dived into discussion, but it could be great to actually provide the definition of what like application security posture management is and what it represents.
Yeah, for sure. So I think I'll give my definition first because I think it's way better, which is just it's everything you need to scan your product in one tool. And I think that's such an easier way to understand what we're doing is all of these SPM tools fundamentally just scan all of your stuff, whether it's code, APIs, cloud environments, whatever, and they surface to you, here's the security results that you need to go fix. And fundamentally, ASPM is just a recognition that at this point, I've identified at least 8 different scanning possibilities within a pipeline. And instead of having 8 different tools, let's just have one tool that can put that full story together. And so it's really telling that full, to use the buzzword, code to cloud story of here's how your code is getting to production, and let's make sure we're scanning it meaningfully for security issues every step of the way. But the way that the reason there's confusion in the industry right now around it is because, and I learned this because, again, I haven't worked at enterprises, and so I had no idea that ASOC was a category, which was the initial category from Gartner. And this was a category of tools that just existed to correlate all of your vulnerability data into a single place. So like the biggest older providers like Nucleus in this, Vulcan's a newer but still bigger company. But there's a ton of startups right now that are very much focused on that market. But Gartner has since turned that term into ASPM, which is this idea of like we are taking all the scan data in and serving as a place to prioritize and remediate. And I just think that's fundamentally missing there's opportunity to provide your own scanning value instead of just this aggregation dashboard there.
Yeah, I think that's what you mentioned actually in your article. We don't have kids here, so it's what the fuck is ASPM? And that's why I also was very curious reading it. I think it's very insightful article. And what actually motivated you to write about it in the first place, and compare it to Gartner?
Yeah, I mean, it was because as I've met with so many vendors, like in the last 3 months, I've probably talked to like 20, 30 different ASPM vendors now because they've all rebranded as this. And it's just wildly different. There's some, like you talk to like ArmorSec or Phoenix Security that are just very focused on this. Like we are aggregating all of your vuln data. We don't provide our own scanner. It's very like light touch. It just reminds me of like a business analyst type platform where you have all these filters and you're writing ETLs essentially against your database of standardized vulnerabilities. And those tools are just so similar to the startups in the like Nucleus space of like DAS, Avalor, Opus, Silk, like all of these. There's a ton of people in that market, and to me, they're not the like Armor Code Phoenix type approach is no different than the Avalor Simplicity approaches of like just aggregating all of your vulnerability data. And then maybe adding a couple of your own little data sparkles on top to sort of make it better or like add some unique value along the way. And those tools were calling themselves ASPMs right next to companies like Arnica, Sneak to an extent, that are really providing specific value. I mean, even you can extend to Apiro, Oxide, like a ton of companies that have built their own scanning value across these different tools and are doing a lot to actually provide their own value beyond just this, like, we are aggregating all of your dashboard of stuff. And so I really wanted to try to separate out those two categories of like, what's the difference between a vulnerability management solution? Because at the end of the day, I think half these acronyms just exist to serve that market of like, we are a vulnerability management solution. From the people that are doing the all-in-one scanning, which is what I think Sneak started. Like Sneak as an SCA tool was never that interesting to me, but as soon as they started offering SAST, IAC, container all in a single place, like that's the beginnings of ASPM. And there's just been other vendors that have since caught up or excelled ahead of them in terms of like what functionality they're providing as part of that platform.
That makes total sense. So you disagree with in a way you disagree with the Gartner definition because for them ASPM is kind of the same as ASOC, but in your opinion ASPM is like ASOC plus already existing scanning capabilities to cover all of the 8 possibilities of scanning during a pipeline.
Yeah, totally. And that's like I wouldn't have even made ASOC a category. Like it's vulnerability management. Like all of these things are just misconfigurations, CVEs, whatever. Like it's a dashboard to manage and prioritize vulnerabilities. Whereas I think we are very quickly seeing each of the individual pipeline scanners become commoditized. And I always hesitate to say that because like people like Endor Labs, for example, are doing really, really amazing things with just SCA. but the market as a whole is definitely consolidating towards like we provide SCA, IAC, container, et cetera, all in a single place. And so that's the value that people are looking for is like, that's the tool sprawl, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, is like people don't want to have it. It gets really hard to manage 10 different tools in one pipeline. If you're managing like different Docker files, you have like, what are you going to have 10 different tools doing PR comments? So every time a developer like pushes a line of code, they're going to have like 10 comments in the PR from different tools. And that's something that people definitely don't want. And so it totally makes sense to have consolidation around the scanning. But there's no reason to include it separate from, or there's no reason to include vulnerability management providers inside of that, because it just doesn't make any, like, the workflow doesn't even make sense theoretically. Like having SemGrep scan something in pipeline and it gets results, and then you have like Sneak come in via webhook and get results, but you're going to like shut those results down and instead send them to somewhere else, which then does a PR comment like rolling up all those results. Like it's just too much. You're adding more complexity instead of taking it away. Whereas the other pitch is like, hey, what if we took out all those tools and we just put in ours? And that's the actual like consolidation that's enticing to people.
And I'm more like, 20, 30, ASPM tools that you interviewed. I think also in our article you mentioned like each of them had something unique. What do you have any examples of these like unique aspects, and do they satisfy the minimum?
It totally comes down to the details, like, which is what it's gonna. I think the main thing for the next year is going to be it's really difficult to tell when you're doing an evaluation, like which tool is actually good at what stuff. And the thing I try to ask usually is like, what have you made in house that you're like really proud of? And it's like this one specific thing usually. And so just some examples are like Apiro's technology. Well, Apiro and Oxeye both have very unique technology for how they're doing data mapping. So their individual scanners, I don't think any of them stand out particularly notable. It's more the way that Apiro will, just like similarly how Bionic was doing it, look at your configuration files and create a mapping of your APIs and then use that for like correlating the data and prioritization. Like that's a unique thing that they do, but is that unique enough to make it so you would choose them over someone else? That's a harder question. And same with Oxeye has an eBPF agent that can map out your application. Arnica has really amazing workflows out of the box where it relies on like a map of your GitHub users, and then can do stuff like send them a Slack alert. They can choose to ignore it or get started on it. If they choose to ignore it for now, it can make a Jira ticket. So like really good workflow stuff out of the box with them. Ox, separate from Oxeye, with putting together code to cloud pictures and like linking container images to where they're built in the GitHub repo. SciCode has some amazing querying capabilities. And so this is what I mean, where it's like there's a lot of little differentiators, and it can be really difficult to tell, the value you're getting on any of these specific things out of it.
And if you like take a look at the market as it is today, there are many vendors in ASPM. Everyone is rebranding as ASPM. Some of them do not have like the scanning capabilities. Some of them do. And among the ones who do, there are small differences, small tweaks, small cool features that they added that makes them different. But overall, they have like the same level of quality. It's hard to differentiate. But do you think there is like a capability that is lacking in all of them, like an obvious thing that they don't have and that they should have?
It's I constantly, I was just talking to someone about this yesterday, that like I am always shocked that no one is taking like fixing seriously as like the thing. And I came to the conclusion in that conversation that it's because vendors are listening to security people too much instead of developers. Because if you listen to me complain about my day-to-day job, it's like I want more ways to prioritize, and like, oh, we wasted all this time having devs fix this thing and it was never actually vulnerable, and we should make better false positive categorization and blah, blah, blah. Like that seems like what it should be the priority. But what actually is the problem is that no one is telling you like as simple as possible, how to actually fix the thing that's broken. Because the approach that security teams take that's so time consuming is if every vulnerability, your goal is to create like a mini POC to see if you're vulnerable, that's going to be incredibly, incredibly time consuming. Just to give an example, it's like if there's a transitive dependency on something that has a vulnerability, and I'm suddenly like reconfiguring the package as though I worked for, like, use HashiCorp as an example, like say you're running Vault and there's a Go vulnerability and you're trying to figure out like, is Vault vulnerable to the Go vulnerability to where someone could like from the outside take advantage of the transitive dependent, like
Yeah.
you're basically, that's going to take you weeks and weeks of time, because you're effectively creating a 0 day for every vulnerability. And so that
Yeah.
approach is just fundamentally broken when the actual answer is like, hey, if you just bump from this version to this version of Vault at this line of code, which is a low risk change, like it just gets fixed. And so trying to instead focus on, I would love to see in a tool, instead of how many alerts are there of like every vulnerability is an alert, every alert is instead how many fixes do you have to do. So, for example, instead of you have 20,000 vulnerabilities, the answer is you have 100 code changes to make. And that's
Yeah.
something that you can actually take to a dev team and prioritize and look at the code changes and figure out what it's going to be. Like, that's something you can actually work with, as opposed to like, what I'm seeing in the market is more and more filters for that 20,000 list. But that's just like putting lipstick on a pig in the sense of like, you're constantly like, oh cool, we launched a new filter where like now instead of 20,000 it's 10,000, and then you add this other filter and it's 5,000 and another filter. Like, adding more and more filters doesn't solve the root of the problem, which is just tell me how to fix the thing. Because there's really not that many fixes either. Like, especially in the container space, most of the time the answer is just to redeploy your image because they've patched the base image, or there's nothing you can do about it because they haven't patched the base image. And so there's really, instead of every image having 10,000 alerts, every image should really just have one alert,
Yeah.
which is redeploy it and then move on. And so it's just the way to consolidate is not through filtering, it's through rolling up by fixes.
And is it something that you would like to know when the product feature is being developed beforehand? Like how many potential vulnerabilities and code fixes, or where would you need to, have like keep some attention, or before you actually develop something? Do you think it will be valuable information or not?
Yeah, I think that whole, there's not a lot of tooling at the moment that helps with like pre-planning sort of risk. There's a couple that I'm aware of that are like, but they're more like taking a threat modeling approach to that. So like trying to help you do threat modeling on different services. And I think what's really hard is that a lot of the focus on evaluations for vulnerability tools is like, how can we stop the bleeding? Or it's like, how can we make sure we're not introducing new vulnerabilities? But the reality of day-to-day AppSec is not like, it takes 5 seconds. Like, most of the time vulnerabilities don't come from new code, because new code is like being focused on, it's being written. It's like when I import a library, developers aren't intentionally importing 10-year-old libraries into their code. Like, the library becomes 10 years old once it's running in your environment for 10 years. And so I'd say, hopefully this is still along the lines of your question, that the focus during an evaluation should really be on like, how is this tool going to help us get through our tech debt, and do we have clear asset ownership, instead of like, what fancy tool does this have to detect some insane, like, look, if a developer does this totally bizarre coding thing, like we detected a SAST vuln. It's like, okay, that's not, like, the real problem is going to be the 5,000 SAST findings after you deploy the tool, not the like once a year that it actually finds something before it makes it out to production.
Yeah, very clear. That's exactly what I asked. And we also, we love to explore the elephants in the room, hence like the name of the podcast. And I think in the article you mentioned that the elephant in the room is that the ASPM and the CSPM are converging. So CSPM for the cloud and SPM for the code. And I think now CSPM is kind of a feature of SPM. So why do you think this is happening?
Yeah, I think I mean, this one of the proudest vendor consolidations I was able to do was to like get rid of CSPM entirely in a former role, because if your environment is 100% controlled by infrastructure as code, there's no reason you should need to scan it for misconfigurations, because you can detect all of it as code. And so I think CSPM, in the not in the Wiz sense, which has a lot of other asterisks around it because they're doing snapshot scanning and like checking the actual running disks themselves, but CSPM in the sense of like divorced from the runtime assets themselves, but just this like, we're going to crawl all of the cloud provider APIs and look for misconfigurations. That tooling is totally obsolete from infrastructure as code. And so ASPM, I think, has a real opportunity to completely take over this market. And that's what I was hopeful was going to happen with Sneak Cloud, but obviously that sort of didn't happen pretty spectacularly. And so I think there is still a lot of... That's why the ASPMs that I get the most excited about are the ones that are taking the full application code to cloud context the most seriously, because they're the ones that are actually giving that full all-in-one security scanning, where you could say, I don't need a CSPM because I'm scanning everything as code, and I have a picture of the runtime environment based entirely on scanning the code. But what's going to be challenging about that, and what should be really scary to ASPM vendors, is that it's pretty obvious that all of the CSPM vendors are starting to get more and more in this space. Whether it's Palo's acquisition of Cider forever ago, and they're launching the Darwin 2.0 thing of like the code to cloud picture, blah, blah, blah. And the whether it's that or it's Lacework launching their SAST and SCA scanner recently, it's pretty obvious that everyone is getting into this space because they're recognizing that CISOs want that all-in-one visibility tool. And so there's a real tear here in the sense that all of those CSPM tools were more heavily funded than the ASPM ones, and they're all further ahead in the market, so they have a lot more money to like deal with this ASPM problem. But conversely, the example I always use is like, it's going to be a long time before I can see a developer installing like the CrowdStrike plugin for their IDE, or like the Lacework plugin for their IDE, et cetera, et cetera. Like those tools they don't have the developer mindshare to easily shift left. Whereas the tools that are built more for developers, I think they can have an easier time shifting right, but they're going to have less resources to do it because that market is newer and smaller, because it didn't expand as rapidly as the initial CSPM one did. And so there is definitely a consolidation that's going to happen here. But it's hard to tell who's going to win because you essentially have more money versus existing adoption. And I honestly don't know which side is going to win out, but it's going to be one of them.
And specifically, so you mentioned several times, like what happened at Sneak? Like, why do you think they didn't like just build this full featured ASPM platform and went straight from SCA to DAST to runtime protection, and they stopped at some point, like adding more scanners and more features?
I mean, the Sneak is still an amazing product, and so I want to make sure I don't come across like I'm bad mouthing them or anything. Like what they have for on the vulnerability side is like way ahead of what most people have. Like most people reference them for the vulnerability data, and so that it all comes down to that like detailed work of actually creating the line by line database of like. I mean, it's essentially the reason that Endor is so good at SCA is because they are manually in there mapping function level reachability to CVE findings. Like that stuff is really hard, and it's the stuff that no one wants to deal with. And so that's the positives. And Sneak obviously just launched their ASPM platform, but by ASPM they're taking the Gartner approach because of course they're huge. Of like, here's how you can manage all of your risk in a single dashboard. But I think the Sneak Cloud thing was so interesting because that there was always a conflict in the product at the foundational level where they were not going to get into runtime, but when you start scanning cloud, you are scanning runtime. And so there was always some conflict that happened there from a product standpoint. And so I think that fundamentally was what caused, I mean, because then it got rolled into IAC, and it's part of the infrastructure as code offering, which I think makes more general sense. I think it's more the code to cloud picture, and that's where I don't know like what. All I know is that it it's not the platform has difficulties trying to show this repo now exists here. Like it can tell you the repo and the deployments, but it can't tell you like this is where this Docker image lives in production. And that's the fundamental picture that I get excited about any tool that can show you that full picture of this code is now running here. Um,
Yeah, yeah, of course. So this is where like ASPM can merge with CSPM for like, and when I mean CSPM, I mean with like CSPM, like the CSPM that goes into the runtime, to have like both the view of the code and where it's actually like living and being like actually running. Um, so that also gives me another question. Like you mentioned, like so the reason why Snyk is like at some point stopped from a strategic decision. Like this is a strategic decision from them. They decided not to go for the full scanning capabilities and focus on some of them. But do you think like the first tool to have like the full scanning capabilities, so the first full ASPM tool, will it be like a scanner, like a code scanner that extended its capabilities up to have like the full pipeline, or will it be a new like entrant to the market that started as an ASPM tool right away? Who will win this race, according
Yeah, I
to
mean
you?
that's I the reason that I like on the latio site, the reason that Ox is the choice for it
Mm-hmm.
is not the value of any of their one scanners, but it's the fact that they do all of it
Mm-hmm.
and they tell that full story. And that's why like the two companies in the ASPM that I like the most are Ox and Aikido. And it's because they focus on different ends of the market. Where
Yeah.
Aikido makes total sense as like a if you're a startup trying to buy a security tool, like you're not buying 15 platforms, right? Like you're going to buy the thing that helps you get SOC 2 and you just want to check all those boxes. And I think that Aikido is wonderful for that. Like plug in one tool, it's running 9 scanners. They're all like they're open about like which open source tools they're using, why, surfacing it, whatever. Like I think that is a clear easy win use case. And then Ox, I think has been so smart in um, their ability to say like bring your own tool or use ours is pretty essential if you're going to try to like launch an
Yeah.
ASPM, because you have to be able to handhold the customer transition,
Yeah.
where no one's going to it's going to be too hard to try to get a company to switch off 8 tools at the same time into just yours.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you can say bring us on, we'll ingest and add value to these existing tools, but then over time you can replace them with our own. I think that's the foundational strategy that I think is just so good. But then I do want to say too that I appreciate conversely, like in my head they're like so closely related because Arnica is instead being a lot more bold and just saying like we have a better scanner than everyone else. You should just switch and do it. And I appreciate that it's just a less smooth pitch.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, of course. But in any case, like it's very hard to like try to move a company away from all their scanners, also because there is a lot of configuration involved. Like for instance, if I take SEMgrep, like most companies using SEMgrep or any kind of static analysis tool, SAS tools, they have their own rules that have been carefully crafted by their application security engineers, like over years to match their precise code base. So if you're trying to move them away from all this knowledge, all this expertise that has been added to the configuration, it will be very hard.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that's easy for me to forget about because I don't have that enterprise background. Um, where the like I've obviously used some custom rules and stuff, but never
Mm-hmm.
at the scale of like I
Yeah.
have hundreds of custom rules across thousands of repos. Um, which is why if you are going to launch a full ASPM platform, yeah, it's not. It either has to be with a small team within the company, or you have to be able to deal with everyone else's scanner, which I think is what you have to be able to do, or else you're also competing against. Like, why would I buy your tool instead of something that I can use to integrate with all of my stuff and orchestrate it that way? Which is why
Yeah.
I think Legit has been so successful, is because like their whole approach is ingesting all of those other scanner data, and showing you which pipelines it exists in, your pipeline coverage. Like that's a really smart easy approach for enterprise sales in that sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. For the listeners that are new to the topic, like for instance that are not familiar with ASPM, what would you advise to like learn more about the latest like innovations in the field of like ASPM and application security in general?
Yeah, I think it's a hot market, and so there's going to be plenty of like marketing stuff.
Yeah.
And so I really think trying to find people who are really excelling at each of the individual tools and understanding like more fully what those pieces are and doing that instead of focusing on like trying to learn more about ASPM as a whole, because the whole is really just made up of all of those specific parts, and you're not going to be able to do a good assessment if you don't know like what makes a good IAC scanner versus a bad one, and what are some of the challenges with that. Because go figure, in a demo, it's going to show like the IAC findings, but it's going to be hard to know what you're looking at if you don't understand like why that's happening.
Yeah.
And so I just look at the leaders in each of those individual categories and understanding what makes them special. So whether it's like the reachability stuff, or if it's like you guys and DAST like running in pipeline, or if it's looking at secret scanning and like what's the difference between like a pre-commit hook versus not having that, like those are the things that are all specifically helpful. And of course you can plug my LinkedIn and YouTube and latio.tech stuff as we
Yeah,
do all of
course.
that.
No,
Yeah.
to be honest, this is
below.
yeah, we will put the link in the description of the podcast anyway. But I mean, like it's really great to have like all this data gathered in one place with all the expertise, because it's actually very hard to navigate all the tools in security. Like this is one other of the points of having many different security tools. Like it's hard to navigate. They all have their pros and cons, and you have to like try to find which one suits your use case. So yeah, what I get from what you're saying is, rather than learning about ASPM in general, you should focus on knowing the vendors and what they're good at, and what they're bad at, in order to choose the right one.
Yeah, and that's a big moment for me was like trying to figure out if I was like bad or not. Like people should feel comfortable blaming the tool instead of themselves for like not understanding
Yeah.
what's happening. And then I was so lost until I came across something from Javon and some others doing a Twilio Netflix meta talk, I think, were the people that were there. And they were just talking about like the state of app security and how they deal with all this stuff. And I was like, oh, this is just like application security is like there's thousands of vulnerabilities. Nobody's fixing anything. They're all
Yeah.
trying to figure out like what's going on. It's just really helpful to know that from people who are like being honest about it, because at the same time, like no one's going to come out and like brag about the fact like here's how many vulnerabilities are in our backlog. Like that's not like a blog post you're going to see from companies, and so it can be hard to track like am I doing a good job or not.
Yeah. Very clear. So great. And one last advice for our listeners in general.
Uh,
Go to
There-
latio.tech.
yeah, that's right. No, the thing I thought of I can't say, and so I have to reconfigure. That it like keeps coming to the forefront of my mind now, and yeah, I learn Kubernetes is my
No, that's a great one. This is a
one.
great one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
'Cause
yeah, definitely. I
Why?
love it.
just because it's all of this stuff is like where it's the thing that people are dancing around the most. Whereas I can't believe there's still a lot of cloud tools I talk to that don't support Kubernetes. And it's where your application is deployed. It's the total context of like all the actual findings. It's the skill set that's hardest to hire for. And it's just the foundation for. There's a reason that in all of these tools, the blind spot is usually the container security stuff, which is something that I think Sneak is still one of the best at, because it's really hard. And like nobody wants to deal with the container stuff. They just want to scan package.jsons all day and say like, oh, here's your JavaScript vulns or whatever.
Yeah.
But trying to follow a container lifecycle out is a lot harder. And so I just think that's the big opportunity slash skill gap there.
Okay. Well, so thanks a lot for the great conversation today. It was nice to have you on our podcast, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Excellent conversation, James. Thank you for being our guest.
Yeah, thank you both.